this episode, we move into a topic that feels new and fast-moving, but still follows the same security logic you have already been building. Artificial intelligence, AI, tools can help organizations search information, draft content, rank results, support decisions, automate steps, and analyze large amounts of data, yet none of that value removes the need for careful governance. In fact, the more useful an AI system seems, the more important governance becomes, because people may trust it quickly before they fully understand its limits, risks, or side effects. Good governance helps an organization decide how AI should be adopted, where it should be limited, what rules must guide its use, and how leaders will stay accountable for the outcomes it produces. That matters for beginners because AI adoption is not just about getting a new tool to work. It is about making sure the organization uses that tool in ways that are lawful, consistent with its values, aligned with its risk tolerance, understandable to the people affected by it, and alert to the possibility that unfair bias can quietly enter important decisions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful starting point is to understand that adoption means much more than simply buying or enabling an AI product. An organization adopts AI when it begins to place that system inside real work, real decisions, real data flows, and real relationships with customers, employees, students, patients, or citizens. Governance is the structure that tells the organization who gets to approve that use, what conditions must be met before it goes live, what reviews must happen afterward, and what boundaries should never be crossed even if the technology appears capable of doing more. Without governance, adoption can turn into drift, where one team experiments here, another team automates something there, and soon the organization is relying on AI in serious ways without a shared understanding of responsibility or risk. For beginners, this is a valuable mindset shift because it moves the conversation away from novelty and toward accountability. The important question is not only whether AI can do something. The more mature question is whether the organization can defend the decision to use it in that way. This matters because AI can affect far more than technical output quality. It can influence customer communication, employee evaluation, document review, fraud detection, content moderation, scheduling, forecasting, and access to services, which means poor adoption choices can create legal, ethical, operational, and reputational damage all at once. A system may sound helpful during a demonstration and still perform badly when it meets real people, messy data, unusual situations, or high-stakes decisions. It may also be used for one purpose at first, and then quietly pushed into broader roles without anyone stepping back to ask whether the original approval still makes sense. Governance protects against that kind of uncontrolled expansion by requiring the organization to think before, during, and after adoption rather than assuming early success proves long-term safety. Beginners should hear this clearly because AI problems do not always begin with a malicious attack. Many begin with ordinary enthusiasm, weak oversight, and the mistaken belief that a useful tool will naturally stay within safe limits without anyone deliberately managing it. Policies play a central role in keeping that from happening because they translate leadership intent into internal rules that teams are expected to follow. A strong policy can define what categories of AI use are allowed, what kinds of data may or may not be entered into such systems, when human review is required, and what approvals must happen before a model is used in a business process. Policy also helps remove confusion by making clear that AI use is not simply a matter of personal preference or convenience. If employees can use AI however they like with no shared boundaries, then sensitive information may be exposed, poor outputs may be trusted too quickly, and different teams may create inconsistent practices that are hard to monitor later. For a beginner, policy is important because it turns broad concern into actual organizational expectation. It says this is how we will use AI, this is where we will be careful, and this is where we will say no even if the technology appears powerful or popular. Laws add another layer because organizations do not adopt AI in a legal vacuum. Depending on the environment, there may be privacy requirements, consumer protection rules, anti-discrimination obligations, contract duties, sector-specific regulations, or reporting expectations that shape what the organization can do and how it must do it. A beginner does not need to memorize every law to understand the larger lesson, which is that an AI system does not become acceptable simply because it improves efficiency or reduces cost. If it uses personal information carelessly, treats people unfairly, misleads users about how decisions are made, or causes harmful outcomes in a regulated setting, legal problems can follow even if the system seemed productive in the short term. Laws matter because they force organizations to think beyond internal convenience and consider the rights, protections, and expectations that exist outside the company as well. Good governance, therefore, includes legal awareness from the beginning, not as an afterthought after damage has already occurred and leaders are trying to explain why no one asked the right questions earlier. Risk appetite helps explain why two organizations might approach the same AI capability very differently even when both understand the technology. Risk appetite is the amount and type of risk an organization is willing to tolerate while pursuing its goals, and that idea matters because no organization can avoid all uncertainty. A company may accept some experimentation in low-impact internal drafting tools while taking a much more cautious approach to AI used in hiring, healthcare, credit decisions, or critical operations. The difference is not just about technical confidence. It is about how much harm could occur if the system behaves poorly, makes unfair recommendations, exposes sensitive data, or creates confusion that people cannot easily correct. For beginners, this is one of the most useful concepts because it explains why governance is not simply a universal yes or no. A mature organization does not ask only whether AI works. It asks whether using AI here fits our mission, our obligations, and our tolerance for possible error, uncertainty, reputational damage, and downstream consequences if something goes wrong. That leads naturally into transparency, which is one of the most important governance ideas around AI adoption. Transparency does not always mean revealing every technical detail of a model, but it does mean that people should have an appropriate understanding of when AI is being used, what role it plays in a process, what limits or uncertainties exist, and who remains responsible for the outcome. A lack of transparency creates problems because people may place too much trust in the system, assume an output is neutral just because it came from software, or fail to recognize when human review is still necessary. Inside the organization, transparency also helps teams understand what data feeds the system, what assumptions underlie it, and how decisions about deployment were made. For beginners, transparency matters because it supports trust without demanding blind faith. A system that affects real people should not operate like a mysterious force that cannot be questioned. Good governance favors enough visibility that users, leaders, and affected individuals can understand the role the system is playing and challenge it when needed. Bias awareness belongs alongside transparency because organizations can easily mistake consistent output for fair output. An AI system may produce polished, repeated, confident answers while still reflecting harmful patterns from its training data, feedback loops, or design choices. Bias awareness means recognizing that systems can treat people or cases differently in ways that are unfair, inaccurate, or harmful, especially when historical data already contains imbalance or past decisions reflected unequal treatment. This matters a great deal when AI is used in areas touching opportunity, access, priority, classification, or risk scoring, because the appearance of efficiency can hide deeper problems in who benefits, who is burdened, and whose needs are overlooked. For a beginner, bias awareness is not about assuming every AI system is automatically unfair. It is about refusing to assume fairness without examination. Good governance requires the organization to look for patterns of harm, question whether outputs are equitable, and build review processes that notice problems before those problems become normalized inside routine operations. A practical way to understand all of this is to imagine an organization using AI to help sort job applicants, prioritize support requests, or flag claims for additional review. A policy should define whether that use is allowed, what data can be used, and when humans must step in. Legal awareness should ask whether the process could violate privacy obligations, employment protections, consumer rights, or industry rules. Risk appetite should help leaders decide whether the consequences of error are low enough, or whether the process touches people so directly that extreme caution is required. Transparency should make clear that AI is part of the process and that people still have responsibility for reviewing meaningful outcomes. Bias awareness should push the organization to test whether certain groups are being treated unfairly, whether historical assumptions are being repeated, and whether the system is amplifying patterns no responsible leader would knowingly approve. Once beginners hear these factors together, governance stops sounding abstract and starts sounding like the practical discipline of preventing lazy, unfair, or reckless adoption. Another important part of governance is recognizing that approval at the start is not enough. AI systems can change in performance as data changes, business use expands, vendors update features, staff use the tool in new ways, or users discover workarounds that were never intended. That means governance must continue through the whole life cycle, including selection, testing, deployment, monitoring, review, and retirement if the tool no longer meets expectations. A beginner should think of this less like giving one final stamp of approval and more like supervising a living process that needs continued attention. If an organization approves an AI system for a narrow purpose and then later uses it in a more sensitive context without new review, governance has already weakened. Ongoing oversight helps the organization notice when accuracy declines, when users become overdependent, when data practices drift, or when new legal and ethical questions emerge. Good governance, therefore, includes the discipline to revisit decisions rather than assuming yesterday's approval is enough for tomorrow's risks. Human accountability remains central throughout that life cycle, and this is one of the most important lessons for beginners to carry forward. Organizations sometimes talk about AI as if responsibility moves from people to the tool once the system is deployed, but that is not how responsible governance works. Leaders approve the use, teams configure the process, staff enter data, reviewers interpret output, and affected people live with the consequences, which means humans remain accountable even when a system automates part of the task. If an organization cannot clearly answer who owns the process, who evaluates performance, who handles complaints, and who can stop the use if problems appear, then governance is weak no matter how advanced the technology seems. This point matters because many AI failures are not really failures of computation alone. They are failures of ownership. When everyone assumes the system is in charge, no one feels responsible for questioning it, correcting it, or limiting it when its use begins creating harm or confusion. Beginners also need to avoid several common misconceptions that can make governance sound heavier or less necessary than it really is. One misconception is that governance slows innovation and therefore should be kept minimal. In reality, weak governance often produces more delay later because unmanaged adoption leads to incidents, mistrust, rework, legal exposure, and emergency restrictions after the fact. Another misconception is that if a vendor claims the tool is responsible or compliant, the organization can relax. Vendors matter, but the adopting organization still owns the decision to use the system in its own environment, with its own people, data, obligations, and business impact. A third misconception is that transparency and bias awareness are mostly public relations concerns rather than security and governance concerns. They are very much governance concerns because trust, fairness, predictability, and defensible decision-making all affect whether the organization can safely operate the system over time. Good governance is not anti-technology. It is what keeps technology from becoming reckless. This is also why strong AI governance usually combines people, process, and technology rather than leaning on one area alone. Policies and approval structures guide behavior. Legal review shapes boundaries. Risk decisions define acceptable exposure. Transparency practices support trust, and bias checks help protect against unfair or distorted outcomes. Technical safeguards matter too, but they are only one part of the picture. A system can be technically impressive and still be poorly governed if no one has defined acceptable use, no one understands the legal stakes, and no one is checking whether the results are harming people unevenly. For a new learner, this broader perspective is valuable because it prevents a narrow view of cybersecurity as only a technical defense function. In modern organizations, secure and responsible AI adoption depends on governance choices just as much as on software quality. When those governance choices are weak, the organization may create risk even while believing it is becoming more efficient and more modern. As you think about scenario-based questions or real workplace discussions, a useful habit is to ask what kind of governance gap is actually present. Is the problem that no policy defines acceptable use? Is it that legal obligations were ignored during rollout? Is it that leaders never decided how much risk they were willing to accept in a sensitive process? Is it that users are not told how AI is affecting decisions that matter to them? Is it that bias was never tested for, even though the system influences opportunities or outcomes for real people? These questions help you reason more clearly because they turn a vague concern about AI into specific governance issues that can be addressed. That is often how beginner-level security judgment develops. You stop reacting only to the novelty of the technology and start identifying the familiar governance principles underneath it. Once you see those principles, the right direction becomes easier to recognize even when the scenario uses new language or unfamiliar tools. As we close, remember that governing AI adoption is not about crushing innovation or treating every new capability as dangerous by default. It is about making sure the organization uses powerful systems in ways that are lawful, deliberate, defensible, and consistent with its responsibilities to people and the mission. Policies matter because they set internal rules and boundaries. Laws matter because organizations must respect obligations that exist beyond convenience and speed. Risk appetite matters because not every use of AI deserves the same level of tolerance for error or uncertainty. Transparency matters because people need to understand the role the system is playing and who remains accountable. Bias awareness matters because efficient output is not the same thing as fair output. When these ideas work together, AI adoption becomes more disciplined, more trustworthy, and more sustainable. That is the real goal of governance, and it is exactly why this topic belongs near the center of modern cybersecurity thinking for beginners.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.